The Brotherhood in Shadow, the Freemasons, the true history of the world's most secret brotherhood, a history for sleep. Heard sits cooked are the chance. Good. You found your way back. Settle in. Turn off whatever light is still on. Tonight, I want to tell you about an organization that has existed for 300 years and about which more books have been written than about almost any other secret society in history. The paradox is that precisely because of this enormous volume of writing, most of which is either fantasy or paranoia, the actual history of Freemasonry remains almost entirely unknown to most people. The Freemasons, not the Freemasons of Hollywood thrillers who control governments and print symbols on dollar banknotes and meet in underground chambers to decide the fate of nations. The real ones. Considerably more complicated, considerably more human, and in a specific sense, considerably more interesting than any conspiracy version of them has managed to be. I will tell you everything slowly. The official birthday of Freemasonry is the 24th of June 1717, London. A tavern called the Goose and Gridiron, near St. Paul's Cathedral. 4 small lodges met and decided to unite as the Grand Lodge of England. This is the first documented Masonic structure. But the Masons themselves claim a history that goes back much further. And understanding those claims and what is true in them and what is legend is the first step toward understanding what Freemasonry actually is. There are 3 main versions of where it came from. The first, and most romantic, traces the lineage to the builders of medieval cathedrals, real stonemasons, the men who built Notre Dame and Chartres and Salisbury and the great Gothic churches of Europe. These craftsmen traveled across the continent following construction projects, and they maintained their own guild organizations with their own rituals of initiation and their own secrets. Technical knowledge about how to cut stone and construct vaulting and manage the complex geometry of a Gothic arch. To distinguish a genuine master from an impostor in a foreign city, where no one knew your reputation and a fraudulent claim could get you hired for work you could not do. They used secret handshakes and passwords that only genuine initiates would know. The Masons say they are the spiritual descendants of these builders. Most historians say this is a beautiful legend with very little documentary support. What is true is that the symbolic language of Freemasonry, the square and compass, the plumb line, the level, the rough ashlar, and the perfect ashlar, is the language of the stonemason's trade. Whether this represents an actual historical connection or a metaphorical one adopted by later gentlemen who found the symbolism appealing is a question that cannot be definitively answered. The second version traces the Masonic origin to the Knights Templar, the military religious order that was destroyed by the French king Philip IV in 1307. The official version of history says the Templars were arrested, tried, tortured into confessions of various heresies, and dissolved. The Masonic version says that some Templars escaped, fled to Scotland, buried their treasures and their secrets, and eventually their traditions merged with the Scottish stonemasons' guilds. This is even more romantic than the cathedral builder's story, and even less supported by actual evidence. The connection between the Templars and Scottish Masonry is primarily asserted in later Masonic degrees, the so-called Scottish Rite, developed in the 18th century, and most serious historians regard it as a piece of mythology that Masons invented for themselves, because the Templar story was exciting and gave the organization an ancient and glamorous pedigree. The third version, and the most historically defensible, traces Freemasonry to 17th century Scottish and English gentlemen who joined stonemasons' guilds not because of their trade, but out of intellectual curiosity. They were called accepted masons, accepted meaning received into membership without practicing the craft, as opposed to operative masons who actually cut stone. Gradually, as more and more gentlemen joined for the philosophy and the fellowship and the ritual, the balance shifted. The working craftsman became a minority and then disappeared entirely from the lodges, and the organization transformed from a trade guild into something that had no real precedent, a philosophical brotherhood that retained the symbols and ceremonial structure of the craft while abandoning the craft itself. The first documented accepted Mason is Sir Robert Moray, a Scottish scholar and military officer. He was admitted to a lodge in Edinburgh in 1641. The first documented English accepted Mason is Elias Ashmole, the antiquarian who founded the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, admitted to a lodge in Warrington in 1646. These are the direct ancestors of modern Freemasonry, and they are not mysterious figures. They are well-documented intellectuals of the early modern period, men who were part of the same cultural moment that produced the Royal Society and the beginnings of modern science. The early accepted Masons were interested in Hermetic philosophy, in Rosicrucianism, in the occult sciences that were part of the intellectual landscape of the 17th century, not as superstition, but as a serious attempt to understand the hidden structure of the universe. The symbolism of the stonemason's craft offered something that these men found philosophically attractive, a system of moral instruction expressed through material objects, the rough stone that must be shaped and smoothed, the plumb line that reveals whether a wall is truly vertical, the level that checks whether a surface is truly horizontal. These were not just tools, they were metaphors for the work of self-improvement, for the effort to make oneself a better person, straighter, more balanced, more carefully constructed. This is the core of Masonic philosophy, and it has remained essentially unchanged for 300 years. Freemasonry is, at its heart, a system of ethical teaching expressed through ritual and symbol. The tools of the stonemason's trade become the instruments of moral reflection. The process of shaping rough stone into a perfect ashlar, a perfectly cut, perfectly smooth building block, becomes the process of shaping an unrefined human being into a virtuous and useful member of society. Whether this philosophy is profound or merely elaborate depends on your point of view. What cannot be disputed is that it appealed enormously to the men of the 18th century who encountered it. The spread of Freemasonry across Europe and the Americas in the 18th century was one of the remarkable cultural phenomena of the period. Within a few decades of the founding of the Grand Lodge of England in 1717, lodges existed in France, Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Russia, and the American colonies. By the end of the century, there were thousands of lodges and hundreds of thousands of members across the Western world. Why did it spread so fast? Because it offered something that the society of the time almost entirely lacked. A space where men of different social backgrounds could meet as equals. An aristocrat and a merchant, a physician and a lawyer, a Protestant and a Catholic. Inside the Masonic Lodge, all were brothers, and the distinctions of rank and religion and wealth that structured every other aspect of life were, at least formally, set aside. This was a genuinely revolutionary idea for a society in which every dimension of existence was determined by birth and station. The noblemen who would never have sat at table with a merchant in any other context, could sit beside him in the lodge and call him brother, and mean it in some sense, however circumscribed and however hedged by the realities of the world outside. The lodges were also spaces where the ideas of the Enlightenment could be discussed with a freedom that was not always available elsewhere. Rationalism, freedom of conscience, the equality of human beings before reason and before law, religious tolerance. These were ideas that, in many of the countries where Masonry spread, were dangerous to express publicly. The Masonic tradition of confidentiality, the principle that what was said in the lodge stayed in the lodge, created a protected space for the free exchange of ideas at a time when such spaces were rare and valuable. This connection between Freemasonry and the Enlightenment is real and documented, and it is one of the reasons that the organization attracted the caliber of membership it did in the 18th century. The list of confirmed Freemasons from the 18th and early 19th centuries reads like a catalogue of the period's most significant figures. George Washington joined a lodge at the age of 20 and remained a Mason for the rest of his life. At his inauguration as the first President of the United States, he took the oath on a Masonic Bible. When he personally laid the cornerstone of the United States Capitol building in 1793, he did so wearing a Masonic apron and using Masonic ceremonial tools. Benjamin Franklin was one of the most active Masons of his time. During his years in Paris as the American representative to the French court, he led a lodge called the Nine Sisters, the most prestigious Masonic lodge in France, whose members included Voltaire and other leading figures of the French Enlightenment. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart joined a Viennese lodge in 1784 and was genuinely, enthusiastically devoted to the organization. He composed music for Masonic ceremonies. His final opera, The Magic Flute, is saturated with Masonic symbolism. The trials of the protagonist, the emphasis on wisdom and silence and brotherhood, the solar imagery and the ritual structure of the plot all reflect the Masonic worldview in ways that Mozart's contemporaries, who were Masons, would have recognized immediately. Frederick the Great of Prussia, Voltaire, Joseph Haydn. The list extends through European culture of the period in ways that make it difficult to discuss the Enlightenment without also discussing Freemasonry, because they were so deeply intertwined. In America, the Masonic membership among the founding fathers was extensive. Washington, Franklin, James Monroe, James Madison, John Hancock, Paul Revere, who was not only a Mason but a Grand Master of the Massachusetts Grand Lodge. The precise number is disputed because membership records from the period are incomplete, but the association between American Freemasonry and the founding of the Republic is genuine and significant. The influence is visible in architecture and symbol. The street plan of Washington, D.C. contains geometric patterns that some people have identified as Masonic symbols. Though whether this was deliberate or coincidental is debated. The Great Seal of the United States, with its pyramid and its eye above it, has been interpreted as Masonic symbolism since the 19th century. The actual history of the Great Seal's design is more mundane. The committee, appointed by the Continental Congress in 1776 to design the seal, Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, went through several rounds of revision over 6 years before the final design was approved. The pyramid and the eye were proposed by Charles Thomson and William Barton in 1782, and were accepted as representing Providence, watching over the new nation. The symbol of an eye in a triangle or above a pyramid was common in 18th century religious iconography and was not exclusively Masonic. Franklin was not involved in the final design, but the association between Freemasonry and American founding mythology was too powerful and too convenient to be complicated by facts, and it has persisted for 250 years. The Catholic Church condemned Freemasonry in 1738 in a papal bull called In Eminenti, issued by Pope Clement XII. The official reason was that the secret oaths and closed meetings of the Masons were suspicious and potentially dangerous to civil order and religious authority. The unofficial reason was that Freemasonry's promotion of religious tolerance and the equality of men from different faiths directly undermined the Catholic Church's claim to be the unique path to salvation, and its insistence that Catholics should not associate as equals with heretics and non-believers. From 1738 to the present day, Catholics have officially been prohibited from joining Freemasonry. The prohibition has been reiterated multiple times, most recently in 1983, when the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the body formerly known as the Inquisition, affirmed that Catholics who join Masonic lodges are in a state of grave sin. In practice, the prohibition has been widely ignored throughout its history. Some of the most devout Catholic countries of Europe had thriving Masonic lodges throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Individual Catholics have always found ways to reconcile their faith with their Masonic membership. The suspicion of Freemasonry was not limited to the Catholic Church. In authoritarian states across history, Freemasonry has been perceived as a threat precisely because of the qualities that made it appealing to Enlightenment intellectuals. Its cross-border networks, its tradition of confidentiality, its promotion of loyalty to a brotherhood that transcended national and political boundaries. Napoleon Bonaparte was not himself a Mason, but he recognized the organizational utility of the network. He placed his brothers and marshals in prominent Masonic positions throughout the territories he controlled, using the lodges as an instrument of Napoleonic influence, while simultaneously keeping the organization under surveillance. The largest anti-Masonic panic in American history came in 1826 with what became known as the Morgan Affair. William Morgan was a former Mason in upstate New York who announced that he intended to publish a book exposing all the secrets of the Masonic rituals. Before the book could be published, Morgan was arrested on a dubious charge, released, and then abducted by a group of men who were widely believed to be Masons. He was never seen again. His body was never found. The scandal was enormous. Masons were accused of having murdered Morgan to prevent him from publishing. The fact that several prominent local officials who were involved in the subsequent investigation were also Masons added fuel to the accusations of a cover-up. An anti-Masonic party emerged and achieved significant electoral success in several states in the late 1820s and early 1830s. The Morgan Affair reveals something important about how Freemasonry functions in the popular imagination. The organization's very secrecy, the closed meetings, the oaths of confidentiality, the private rituals, makes it impossible to definitively disprove accusations against it. You cannot prove that something did not happen in a meeting that no outsider attended. The secrecy that protected the lodge's internal discussions from outside surveillance also made the lodge permanently vulnerable to any accusation that the outside world chose to make. The Nazis classified Freemasonry as a Jewish conspiracy, despite the fact that Jewish people were often excluded from Masonic lodges in practice, and that Freemasonry and Judaism have no organizational connection. Nonetheless, the Nazis abolished all Masonic lodges in Germany After coming to power in 1933 and sent thousands of Masons to concentration camps, estimates of the number of Masons killed in the Holocaust range from 80,000 to 200,000. The Nazi persecution was based almost entirely on ideology and conspiracy theory. The belief that Freemasonry was part of the same international Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy that Nazi propaganda attributed to every phenomenon it wanted to condemn. The actual content of Freemasonry, its emphasis on brotherhood, on the equality of men of different faiths, on individual moral improvement, was precisely the kind of thing that Nazi ideology found threatening. Communist regimes across Eastern Europe similarly persecuted Freemasonry after World War II for similar reasons. The cross-border networks, the allegiance to a non-national brotherhood, the bourgeois character of the membership, and the general suspicion that any organization with secrets was an organization that might be plotting against the state. In several countries, including China and most Arab states, Freemasonry remains officially banned to this day. The Masonic rituals that have generated such enormous anxiety throughout history are, when you actually examine what is known of them, considerably less terrifying than the legend suggests. The basic structure of Freemasonry divides members into degrees. There are three fundamental degrees recognized by virtually all Masonic jurisdictions: entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason. Each degree has its own ceremony of initiation, its own symbolic content, its own obligations, and its own signs and tokens by which members recognize each other. The ceremony of initiation as an entered apprentice, the first degree, involves the candidate being blindfolded and led into the lodge room, being asked certain questions, taking an obligation of secrecy and brotherly conduct, and receiving instruction in the symbolic meaning of the Masonic working tools. The details vary by jurisdiction and have changed over time, but the basic structure has been remarkably consistent for 3 centuries. The central legend of Freemasonry is the story of Hiram Abiff. In the biblical account, Hiram was the master craftsman sent by the king of Tyre to assist Solomon in building the temple in Jerusalem. In Masonic legend, Hiram was the grand master of the builders of Solomon's temple, and he possessed a secret word of great power, the master's word, which he refused to reveal to 3 workers who demanded it prematurely. They killed him. His murder, the discovery of his body, and the search for the lost secret are the dramatic substance of the 3rd-degree ritual, which is the most elaborate and most emotionally significant of the 3 basic degrees. This legend has no basis in the biblical text beyond the mention of Hiram as a craftsman. It was developed by the Masons themselves, probably in the late 17th or early 18th century, as a vehicle for teaching the virtues of fidelity and integrity. A man who will die rather than betray his obligations is the model that the ritual presents. Beyond the 3 basic degrees, there exist in various Masonic jurisdictions additional or appendant degrees, sometimes many additional degrees. The Scottish Rite, the most widely recognized system of additional degrees, contains 33 degrees in total, each with its own ritual and symbolic content. The York Rite is another system of additional degrees, with a different structure and emphasis. These appendant degrees are elaborations and extensions of the basic Masonic system, drawing on a wider range of symbolic sources: Templar imagery, Rosicrucian elements, Kabbalistic symbolism, chivalric orders. The accumulation of all this symbolic material over 3 centuries of elaboration and development has produced a rich and strange mythology that bears very little resemblance to what any individual Mason actually experiences at a typical lodge meeting, which generally consists of the reading of minutes, the payment of dues, some ritual work, and dinner afterward. The gap between the Masonic mythology and the Masonic reality is the source of much of the confusion about the organization. The mythology, with its Templar connections and its ancient Egyptian imagery, and its 33 degrees and its all seeing eye, sounds like something enormously significant and potentially sinister. The reality, a few dozen men in aprons sitting in a meeting room in a building that used to be a fire station, sounds like nothing in particular. Both are true simultaneously. The mythology is real as mythology. It is what Masons believe about themselves, or believed about themselves in earlier centuries, and it shaped how the organization developed and what it meant to its members. The reality is also real. It is what actually happens when real people gather in real buildings to conduct real meetings. The Masonic contribution to charitable work is real and substantial. In the United States alone, Masonic organizations contribute an estimated $2 billion annually to charitable causes, hospitals, scholarship funds, children's programs, disaster relief. The Shriners Hospitals for Children, which provide free specialized medical care to children regardless of ability to pay, are a Masonic charity. The Scottish Rites charitable programs fund research into childhood language disorders. The network of Masonic support for brothers in financial difficulty, the informal mutual aid that has always been part of lodge culture, has provided a safety net for millions of men and their families over 3 centuries. This charitable dimension of Freemasonry is almost entirely absent from the popular image of the organization, which focuses exclusively on the ritual and the secrecy. But it was, from the beginning, as central to Masonic practice as the ceremonial, the concrete expression of the brotherly love that the rituals taught in abstract. Modern Freemasonry is a considerably more transparent organization than it has been at most points in its history. The oaths of secrecy that once covered everything have been progressively narrowed. Most jurisdictions now protect only the specific signs and tokens by which Masons recognize each other, rather than all Masonic content. The rituals, which were supposedly the deepest secret of all, have been published in detail in countless exposes over 3 centuries and are freely available to anyone who wants to read them. The Grand Lodges of most jurisdictions maintain public websites. Many lodges hold open days for prospective members. The United Grand Lodge of England, the oldest Masonic governing body in the world, maintains a public museum and library at its headquarters in London on Great Queen Street in Covent Garden. The membership numbers have declined significantly since the mid-20th century. In the United States, Masonic membership peaked at around 4 million in the 1950s and has declined to under 1 million today. The decline reflects broader cultural changes. The decreased participation in voluntary organizations of all kinds, the fragmentation of community life, the reduced prestige of established institutions, rather than anything specific to Freemasonry. The organization that remains is, by most accounts, a genuine, if somewhat anachronistic community of men who find value in the ritual, the fellowship, and the charitable work. The average lodge meeting is a fairly mundane affair. The average Mason is a middle-aged man of conventional views who joined because a friend or family member was a member, and who stays because he finds the meetings congenial and the connections useful. The gap between this reality and the image of the all-powerful secret society that controls governments and shapes history is so vast that it seems almost impossible that the two could refer to the same organization. And yet they do, because the image and the reality have always coexisted. The elaborate mythology serving psychological and social functions that the humdrum meetings themselves could not fully serve. People need mystery. They need the sense that there are hidden levels of significance beneath the surface of ordinary life. They need the idea that somewhere, behind closed doors, important things are being decided by important people according to principles that mere outsiders cannot access. Freemasonry has been serving this need for its members and for its opponents for 300 years. For its members, the ritual provides a genuine sense of participating in something ancient and significant, of being part of a brotherhood that stretches back through history. For its opponents, the image of the secret society provides a convenient explanation for why the world is not as it should be. The conspiracy theory that makes sense of a world that otherwise seems chaotic and unjust. Both of these uses of Freemasonry are, in their way, understandable human needs. Neither of them has very much to do with what actually happens in the lodge on a Tuesday evening. The room is quiet. The curtains are drawn. The men in their white aprons sit in their appointed places around the lodge room. The master of the lodge sits in the east, where the sun rises. The senior warden sits in the west. The junior warden sits in the south. The words of the ritual are spoken. They are the same words that were spoken in this same order 100 years ago, 200 years ago. There is something in the repetition, in the sense that you are doing what men before you did, in the same way, for the same reasons, that provides a kind of continuity with the past that ordinary life does not offer. Whether that continuity is genuine or constructed, whether the connection to the cathedral builders and the Templars and the ancient mysteries is real or invented, these questions matter to historians, but perhaps less to the men in the room. What matters to them is that the ritual is real, the brotherhood is real, the dinner afterward is real, and the friend sitting beside them who will help them if they need help is real. The worst secret of Freemasonry is that there is no terrible secret. The lodges do not control governments. The Masonic network does not manipulate markets. There is no grand architect of the universe meeting in an underground chamber, making decisions about the fate of nations. What there is, what there has been for 300 years, is a group of men who believe in trying to be better than they were, who express that belief through ritual and symbol, who support each other in the practical difficulties of life, and who donate large amounts of money to hospitals and schools and other charitable causes. This is not glamorous. It does not make for a good thriller. It does not explain why the world is the way it is, or why powerful men seem to act in concert, or why some people get ahead while others do not. It is just people trying to do better, meeting on Tuesday evenings in a building that used to be a fire station. The night outside the lodge is quiet. The city goes about its business. In the building with frosted windows and no sign on the door, the meeting is ending. The men shake hands in the particular way they have shaken hands for 300 years. They put away their aprons. They walk out into the ordinary world. Nothing has changed. Nothing was decided. No government has been overthrown. No market manipulated. No conspiracy advanced. Just a meeting. Just a brotherhood. Just men trying in their way to be better. The street is empty. The night is quiet. The specific symbols of Freemasonry deserve closer examination because they are the most visible face of the organization and the source of the most persistent popular mythology. The square and compass is the most universally recognized Masonic symbol, appearing on lodge buildings, on Masonic jewelry, on the aprons that members wear during ceremonial work. The square is the tool used to check right angles. The compass is the tool used to draw circles and measure distances. Together, they represent, in Masonic teaching, the proper relationship between matter and spirit, between the physical world and the moral world, between action and aspiration. The letter G that often appears between the square and compass has been given various interpretations. In English speaking Masonry, it is said to stand for both geometry, the foundational science of the builder's craft, and God, or the great architect of the universe, which is the Masonic term for the Supreme Being. The use of a non denominational term for God was itself a statement of the religious tolerance that Freemasonry promoted. The God of the lodge was not specifically the Christian God, or the Jewish God, or the Muslim God, but a universal principle accessible to men of any faith. The all-seeing eye, the eye within a triangle or radiating beams of light, is probably the Masonic symbol most familiar to people who know nothing else about the organization, primarily because of its presence on the reverse of the American $1 bill. As already noted, the connection between the Great Seal design and Freemasonry is historically questionable, but the symbol itself is genuinely Masonic, representing the watchful presence of God over human affairs and the impossibility of concealing one's true character from divine observation. In a moral system that depended on self-improvement rather than external enforcement, the idea that one's actions were always observed by an omniscient eye served a useful function. The apron worn by Masons during lodge work has its origin in the working apron of the operative stonemason, who wore it to protect his clothing from stone dust. In speculative masonry, the apron became the badge of a mason, worn to lodge meetings as a symbol of the craft's heritage. Masonic aprons range from plain white lambskin for new initiates to elaborately decorated aprons for senior officers and past masters, and the degree of decoration on a mason's apron indicates his rank and experience within the organization. The white lambskin of the basic apron is itself symbolic, representing innocence and the purity of intention with which a Mason should approach his obligations. It is, Masons are told, more honorable than the jewels of kings or the decorations of heroes, because it represents not achievement but aspiration. This emphasis on intention and aspiration rather than achievement is characteristic of Masonic teaching throughout. The rough ashlar, the unworked stone as it comes from the quarry, represents the unimproved person, full of imperfections and irregularities. The perfect ashlar, the stone that has been carefully cut and smoothed, represents the person who has been improved by education and self-discipline. The work of making a mason is the work of shaping the rough ashlar into the perfect one, and the work is never finished. The ritual structure of the 3 basic degrees follows a progression that mirrors this symbolic journey. The entered apprentice is the rough ashlar, new, unformed, entering the lodge with much to learn. The fellow craft, the 2nd degree, is in the process of improvement, receiving instruction in the liberal arts and sciences, developing the faculties of mind and character. The Master Mason has achieved the 3rd degree, and with it a certain completion, though the completion is always provisional, because the work of self-improvement has no final terminus. The legend of Hiram Abiff, central to the 3rd degree, carries a specific teaching about integrity under pressure. Hiram is killed because he will not compromise his obligations even to save his life. The Masonic ideal is a man whose word is absolute, who cannot be threatened or bribed into betraying, what he has committed to. In the context of the 18th century, when social bonds were structured by patronage and obligation, and when the breaking of one's word could have serious practical consequences, this was a morally and practically significant ideal. The ritual enactment of Hiram's death and the search for his body, which forms the dramatic core of the third degree ceremony, is, by most accounts of those who have experienced it, a powerful emotional experience. The candidate goes through a symbolic death and resurrection, ending the ceremony with a sense of having passed through something significant and emerged changed on the other side. Whether this sense of transformation corresponds to any actual psychological or moral change is a question that each individual must answer for himself. The philosophical system that underlies Masonic teaching has its roots in the intellectual culture of the 17th and 18th centuries, specifically in the traditions of natural philosophy, Neoplatonism, and Hermeticism that were part of the educated Europeans' mental landscape in the period when speculative Masonry was forming. Hermeticism, the philosophical tradition attributed to the mythical figure of Hermes Trismegistus, held that the universe was structured according to hidden principles that could be understood through careful study and initiation. The idea that there are levels of knowledge accessible only to those who have been properly prepared and initiated is central to the Hermetic tradition, and it maps directly onto the Masonic degree structure. The 3 degrees of Masonry are, in this reading, 3 levels of initiation into progressively deeper understanding of the principles that underlie the universe and human life. Rosicrucianism, another 17th century movement closely related to Hermeticism, contributed its own symbolism and ideas to the developing Masonic tradition. The Rosicrucians claimed to possess ancient secret wisdom that, when properly understood and applied, could reform society and humanity. The early accepted Masons were steeped in Rosicrucian thought, and traces of it appear throughout the Masonic ritual system. Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical tradition, also contributed elements to the Masonic symbolic vocabulary, particularly in the higher degrees. The emphasis on the Temple of Solomon as the central Masonic symbol is itself a point of connection between Masonic and Kabbalistic thought. Since the temple holds enormous significance in the Kabbalistic tradition as a symbol of cosmic and spiritual order, these philosophical traditions were not fringe concerns in the 17th and 18th centuries. They were part of the mainstream intellectual culture, taken seriously by educated men across Europe. Isaac Newton spent more time on alchemy and biblical prophecy than on the mathematics for which he is now remembered. Gottfried Leibniz, the co-inventor of calculus, was deeply interested in Hermetic philosophy. Robert Boyle, one of the founders of modern chemistry, was a practicing alchemist. The boundary between what we now call science and what we call mysticism was not clearly drawn in this period, and the men who founded speculative Masonry inhabited both sides of it comfortably. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th and the intellectual culture changed, as natural philosophy became science, as alchemy became chemistry, as the Hermetic and Rosicrucian traditions became increasingly marginal to educated thought, Freemasonry retained its symbolic vocabulary and its ritual structure even as the philosophical framework that had originally animated them became less familiar. The symbols remained. The understanding of what they pointed to became less shared, more varied, more a matter of individual interpretation. This is one of the reasons that Freemasonry means different things to different Masons. For some, it is primarily a philosophical system, a guide to moral improvement. For others, it is primarily a social organization, a network of congenial men who enjoy each other's company and help each other in practical ways. For others, it is primarily a charitable body, a vehicle for organized giving. For others, the ritual is the primary attraction, the sense of participating in something ancient and ceremonially rich. For others, it is primarily a family tradition, something their father and grandfather did, and that they do in continuation of that lineage. The organization contains all of these motivations simultaneously and has always done so. This diversity of motivation is part of what has made it resilient across 300 years and across enormous changes in the cultural and social landscape. The lodge building itself deserves some description because the physical space in which Masonic ritual takes place is carefully designed to support and enhance the symbolic system. The typical lodge room is oriented east to west, mirroring the orientation of traditional churches and, the Masons say, the path of the sun. The master of the lodge sits in the east, in a chair raised on a dais, representing the sun at its rising, light and knowledge coming into the world. The senior warden sits in the west, representing the setting sun, the end of the day's work, the call to rest. The junior warden sits in the south, where the sun reaches its meridian, the height of the day, the hour of refreshment. The floor of the lodge room is typically decorated with a black and white checkered pattern representing the duality of existence, light and dark, good and evil, knowledge and ignorance. In the center of the floor stands the volume of sacred law, a Bible in most Anglophone lodges, though other sacred texts are used in lodges with members of different faiths, along with the square and compass. The walls of the lodge room are typically plain or decorated with symbolic images, the sun and moon, the three lesser lights of the lodge, the images of the degrees. The atmosphere is meant to be one of solemnity and attention, the space set apart from the ordinary world, dedicated to the work of the evening. When a lodge is open for work, the master performs a ceremonial opening that brings the lodge from its dormant state into an active one. When the work is done, the lodge is closed with a corresponding ceremony that returns it to its dormant state. Between the opening and the closing, the space of the lodge is notionally separate from the ordinary world, a protected space in which the work of masonry can be done. This ritual marking of the boundary between the sacred space of the lodge and the ordinary world outside it is one of the oldest human impulses. The creation of a dedicated space for the work that matters most, separated from the distractions of everyday life. Churches do it, temples do it, courts of law do it. The lodge is another example of this universal human practice. The night that produced modern Freemasonry, the meeting at the Goose and Gridiron Tavern on June the 24th, 1717, was itself unremarkable in most of its particulars. 4 lodges, a few dozen men, a decision to elect a Grand Master and form a governing body. The minutes of the meeting, which survive, describe something that sounds more like a committee meeting than the birth of a world-changing institution. And yet, from this meeting, and from the gradual elaboration of its ritual and philosophy over the following decades, something emerged that would encompass millions of members across the world, that would be blamed for revolutions and assassinations and the manipulation of history, that would count among its members some of the most significant figures of the last 3 centuries, and that would persist in various forms to the present day. The institution outlasted the intellectual culture that produced it. It outlasted the Enlightenment. It outlasted the political orders Absolute monarchy, Republican revolution, Napoleon's empire, Victorian stability, the cataclysms of the 20th century that succeeded each other across the period of its existence. It adapted imperfectly and incompletely to each new context, retaining its basic structure while the world around it changed beyond recognition. Whether this persistence reflects something genuinely valuable in the organization, some human need that it serves that cannot easily be served elsewhere, or simply institutional inertia and the conservatism of those who have invested in a tradition, is a question that the history does not definitively answer. What the history does show is that the need for brotherhood, for a chosen family, for a group of people who will support you without the biological obligation of actual family and without the transactional nature of professional relationships, is persistent and deep. The Masonic Lodge, at its best, serves this need. The rituals that surround it may be elaborate and the mythology may be overblown, but the core of what the Lodge offers is something that human beings have always needed and that the modern world has become less good at providing. The friend who will show up when you are in trouble, the community that will support your family if you cannot, the brotherhood that will bury you properly and remember that you were here. These are not small things. The geography of Freemasonry, the specific places where it flourished, and the specific places where it struggled, tells its own story about the relationship between the organization and the societies it inhabited. In England, where modern Freemasonry was born, the organization developed in close relationship with the establishment. The Grand Lodge of England attracted royal patronage early. The Prince of Wales, later George IV, became Grand Master in 1790, and the royal connection has been maintained ever since. The Duke of Kent is the current Grand Master. This royal association gave English Freemasonry a degree of social respectability and political safety that lodges in other countries did not always enjoy. It also shaped the character of English Masonry toward the conservative, establishment friendly, charitable, work focused organization that it is today. In France, the trajectory was different and more dramatic. French Freemasonry, the Grande Loge de France, later the Grand Orient de France, developed in a more politically charged environment and eventually took a more radical direction. In 1777, the Grand Orient of France dropped the requirement that members believe in God, a requirement that all other major Masonic jurisdictions maintain, and declared itself non-denominational in a more thoroughgoing sense. This split French Masonry from the mainstream of international Freemasonry, and the United Grand Lodge of England has not recognized the Grand Orient of France as a legitimate Masonic body since that change. French Masonic lodges in the years before the Revolution of 1789 were indeed spaces where radical political ideas circulated. The connection between Masonic networks and the revolutionary movement has been a matter of historical debate for 2 centuries. The moderate position, probably the historically most defensible, is that Masonic lodges were among the spaces where Enlightenment political ideas could be discussed freely, and that this discussion contributed to the intellectual climate from which the revolution emerged without there being any organized Masonic conspiracy behind the revolution itself. The conspiracist version, fully developed in the work of the Abbé Baruel in 1797 and widely influential throughout the 19th century, held that the revolution was in fact a deliberate Masonic plot planned and executed by lodges that had been infiltrated and directed by a shadowy inner circle of illuminated conspirators. Barruel's work, Memoirs, illustrating the history of Jacobinism, was enormously influential in establishing the template for anti-Masonic conspiracy theory that has persisted to the present day. The Illuminati, the organization that appears in every conspiracy theory about Freemasonry, were real in a limited sense. Adam Weishaupt, a professor of canon law at the University of Ingolstadt in Bavaria, founded the Order of the Illuminati in 1776. It was a secret society with an elaborate internal degree structure, operating partly through Masonic lodges in Germany and attempting to promote Enlightenment rationalism and opposition to religious superstition. The Bavarian government discovered the organization, suppressed it, and expelled Weishaupt in 1785. The organization effectively ceased to exist. In the popular imagination, the Bavarian Illuminati never died. They went underground, infiltrated Freemasonry, and have been secretly running the world ever since. There is no credible historical evidence for this narrative. The actual history of the Illuminati, a small, short-lived secret society in Bavaria that was founded, discovered, and suppressed within 9 years, is considerably less dramatic than the mythology. The American Masonic tradition developed its own distinctive character that reflects the specific circumstances of the new republic. The founding fathers who were Masons brought to their Masonry the same republican idealism that shaped the American constitutional project. The emphasis on equality, on the consent of the governed, on the rights of individual conscience. American Masonry also developed over time a more democratic internal structure than European Masonry. The elaborate class distinctions that shaped European lodge life, the social hierarchy that persisted even within the formal equality of the brotherhood, were less pronounced in the American context. The American Mason of the 19th century was more likely to be a small businessman or artisan than a European Mason of the same period, who was more likely to be from the professional or aristocratic classes. The 19th century was, in many ways, the golden age of American Masonry. The organization grew enormously, developed its charitable institutions, built its imposing lodge buildings in the centers of American cities, and established itself as a respected and even prestigious part of community life. The Morgan Affair produced a temporary crisis in the 1820s, but the organization recovered and continued to grow. The peak came in the 1950s, when approximately 4 million American men were Masons, perhaps 10% of the adult male population. This was the high point of American civic culture generally, the period of the PTA and the Rotary Club, and the Bowling League, and the Veterans of Foreign Wars post, when voluntary organizations of all kinds flourished and served as the primary infrastructure of community life. The decline since the 1950s reflects the decline of this civic culture generally. The automobile, the television, the suburb, and later the internet all contributed to the atomization of American community life in ways that reduced participation in the voluntary organizations that had previously structured it. Freemasonry participated in this decline, along with the Elks and the Rotary Club, and the Labor Union and the church congregation. The organization that remains in the 21st century is smaller, older, and less culturally central than it was in the mid-20th century. The average age of American Masons has been rising for decades. Lodges that once had hundreds of active members now have dozens. Some lodges have closed or merged for lack of membership, but the lodges that remain are by the accounts of those who participate in them. Genuine communities, places where men who find value in the ritual and the fellowship continue to meet and to support each other in the way that Masons have always done. The question of why Freemasonry generates such persistent conspiracy theories, why it has been blamed over 3 centuries for almost every significant negative event in Western history, is itself worth examining. The conspiracy theory needs an agent. When things go wrong, when revolutions happen that seem to come from nowhere, when powerful men seem to act in coordinated ways that serve the common interest, when the world seems to be shaped by forces that ordinary people cannot see or understand, the conspiracy theory provides an explanation. There must be someone behind it. There must be a plan. There must be a group of people who know what the plan is and are executing it. Freemasonry has been a perfect vehicle for this kind of projection for several reasons. It is genuinely secret in the sense that it has closed meetings and confidential rituals. It is genuinely large, encompassing millions of members across the world. It is genuinely connected in that Masons in different places are linked by a common initiation and a common system of recognition. And it genuinely includes powerful people, politicians, judges, military officers, businessmen, whose cooperation in Masonic fellowship can easily be misread as cooperation in a conspiracy. The Masonic network is real. The coordination of that network for sinister purposes is not. What the network actually does, what it has always actually done, is provide its members with a sense of brotherhood and with practical support in the form of social connections, business referrals, and mutual assistance in times of difficulty. A Mason who moves to a new city and presents himself at a local lodge will be welcomed as a brother, introduced to the local membership, and given a network of connections in his new home. This is a genuinely useful service, and it has made Masonic membership practically valuable beyond its philosophical and ceremonial aspects throughout the organization's history. The conspiracy theory confuses the existence of a network, which is real, with the existence of a coordinated agenda, which is not. People who share a common affiliation will naturally tend to trust each other and to cooperate in their interactions. And this natural tendency can produce outcomes that look from outside like deliberate coordination. When a Mason gives a business contract to another Mason, or recommends a Mason for a position, or votes for a Mason's proposal in a professional context, the result may look like the execution of a plan without being any such thing. This is what is sometimes called the old boys network problem. The tendency of people who share backgrounds and affiliations to favor each other in ways that produce systemic advantages for the group without any explicit coordination. Freemasonry has always been susceptible to this tendency, and it is one of the genuinely legitimate criticisms that can be made of the organization, particularly in the context of professional and judicial settings, where the principle that decisions should be made without regard to personal affiliation is important. The distinction between a network that provides natural advantages through shared affiliation and a conspiracy that deliberately coordinates to advance hidden agendas is not always obvious from outside. But it is a crucial distinction, and failing to make it is what produces the conspiracy theory. The actual inner life of a Mason, what it feels like to be a member of the organization, what draws people to it and keeps them there, is almost entirely absent from both the conspiracy literature and the popular understanding. What Masons say when they describe their experience of the organization tends to be consistent across different times and places. They talk about the ritual, the experience of participating in something ancient and ceremonially rich, of speaking words that connect them to generations of men who spoke the same words before them. They talk about the fellowship, the specific quality of the relationship with lodge brothers, which has a warmth and an obligation that differs from ordinary friendship. They talk about the values, the emphasis on integrity, on brotherly love, on support for those in need, which they find genuinely meaningful even when the language in which they are expressed is archaic. They also talk not infrequently about things that the Lodge has not delivered, the promise of deep wisdom that turns out to be ordinary moral instruction, the expectation of profound secrets that turns out to be well publicized rituals, the vision of a brotherhood of exceptional men that turns out to be a group of quite ordinary men who happen to wear aprons on Tuesday evenings. This gap between expectation and reality is a recurring theme in accounts of Masonic experience. The organization's mystique, the product of 3 centuries of conspiracy theory and romantic mythology, raises expectations that the actual lodge meeting cannot fulfill. The candidate who joins expecting to be initiated into ancient mysteries finds instead a ceremony that is elaborate and symbolically rich, but that points toward moral improvement rather than cosmic revelation. Some are disappointed. Some find that the ceremony and the fellowship, taken on their own terms rather than measured against inflated expectations, are genuinely valuable. Some stay for years out of loyalty to the institution and the brothers they have met within it, long after the initial promise has been revealed as something more modest than they imagined. This is the human reality of Freemasonry, not sinister, not transcendent, but genuinely human. An organization made of people, serving human needs with all the limitations and imperfections that implies. The night outside the lodge is quiet. The men who have spent the evening together are returning to their ordinary lives. Some will see each other again at the next meeting. Some will help each other in the way that brothers help each other, practically and without drama. Tomorrow is an ordinary day. The lodge building will be locked and dark. The aprons will be folded and put away. The ritual words will be silent until the next Tuesday evening. And somewhere in the city, someone who has heard about the Freemasons and the secrets will wonder what really goes on behind those frosted windows. The answer is not very much, and also something genuinely human and genuinely valuable, which is not the same as nothing. The women of Freemasonry, or rather, the complex question of women in Freemasonry, is a dimension of the organization's history that is rarely discussed and that reveals a great deal about both the organization's values and its contradictions. Traditional Freemasonry, as practiced in the lodges of the United Grand Lodge of England and the Grand Lodges recognized by it, is exclusively male. Women are not admitted. This exclusion is not a peripheral feature of the organization. It is described by its defenders as fundamental to the nature of Masonry, though the reasons given for it have changed over time. In the 18th century, the exclusion of women from Masonic lodges was entirely unremarkable. It reflected the general exclusion of women from public and professional life that characterized the period. The lodge was a male space because the professional and intellectual world from which it drew its membership was a male space. As that changed, as women entered professional life, as the cultural argument for equal access to institutions became more compelling, the justification for excluding women from Masonry became more difficult to articulate. The explanations offered range from tradition, It has always been this way. To theology, the degrees reference male figures and male experience. To a claim about the specific character of male fellowship, something is possible between men in the absence of women that is not possible in mixed company. None of these arguments is entirely satisfying, and a significant portion of the Masonic world has found them unpersuasive. In France, from the late 18th century onward, lodges of adoption were established that admitted women, initially under the sponsorship of regular male lodges, later as independent organizations. The Order of the Eastern Star, founded in America in the mid 19th century, admitted both men and women and was associated with Masonic lodges. The Co-Masonry movement, founded in France in 1893, when a woman was admitted to a regular lodge and the resulting organization refused to expel her, has developed into a worldwide network of mixed-sex lodges. In Britain, two all-female Grand Lodges exist: the Order of Women Freemasons and the Honorable Fraternity of Ancient Freemasons, that practice rituals essentially identical to those of the male lodges. These organizations are not recognized by the United Grand Lodge of England, which maintains that Masonry by definition is a male institution. The existence of these female and mixed organizations demonstrates that there is nothing in the content of Masonic ritual that is inherently male, that women can practice the same ceremonies and find the same value in them. The argument for exclusion is therefore primarily one of tradition rather than principle, and the weight of tradition is considerable in an organization that defines itself so heavily through its connection to the past. The question of race in American Freemasonry has a history that is even more troubled. Prince Hall Masonry, named for Prince Hall, a black man who was initiated into a military lodge in Boston in 1775, and who subsequently founded African Lodge Number 1 in Boston in 1776, is the tradition of Freemasonry developed by and for Black Americans. Prince Hall and his brethren sought recognition from the established white Grand Lodges of America and were consistently refused. The reasons given were various and often contradictory. Questions about the legitimacy of their initiation, about the regularity of the charter, but the underlying reality was that white American Masonry was not prepared to acknowledge black men as Masonic brothers in the full sense that the ritual required. Prince Hall Masonry developed independently, establishing its own Grand Lodges, state by state, maintaining its own traditions and growing into a substantial organization. Its membership included some of the most significant figures of African American history: Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Thurgood Marshall, Jesse Jackson, among many others. The formal recognition of Prince Hall, Grand Lodges by mainstream American Grand Lodges, the acknowledgement that they are regular, legitimate Masonic bodies whose members are entitled to full Masonic recognition, has proceeded slowly and unevenly over the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st. Most American Grand Lodges now extend this recognition, but the process took decades longer than it should have and reflected the broader failures of American institutions to live up to the stated principles. These failures of Masonry to practice the brotherhood it preached across lines of gender and race are part of the organization's honest history and cannot be excused by the idealism of its stated values. An organization that claims to regard all men as brothers and then excludes women entirely, and admits black men only to a separate, lesser recognized parallel structure, has a gap between ideal and practice that demands acknowledgement. Freemasonry is not unique in this gap. Most institutions that claim universal values have historically failed to practice them universally. But the gap is particularly visible in Freemasonry's case because the universal brotherhood is so explicitly and repeatedly stated as the organization's core commitment. The historical figures who were Masons and the way their Masonry related to the other activities provides another dimension for understanding the organization. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's Masonic membership was genuine and enthusiastic. He joined the Lodge zur Wohltätigkeit, Beneficence, in Vienna in December of 1784 and was active in Masonic circles until his death in 1791. The lodge meetings he attended included some of the leading intellectual figures of Vienna, and the discussions that took place there were part of the Enlightenment conversation about reason, tolerance, and human improvement. His Masonic compositions, the Maurerische Trauermusik, the cantatas written for lodge ceremonies, are genuine attempts to give musical expression to Masonic themes. The Magic Flute, his final opera, completed in the last year of his life, draws so heavily on Masonic symbolism that it was once described as a Masonic catechism in operatic form. The Trials of Tamino, the emphasis on wisdom and silence and brotherhood, the transformation from profane darkness to sacred light, the figure of Sarastro as the wise master, all of these reflect the Masonic degree structure and its associated values. Mozart was not using Masonic symbols decoratively. He was a committed Mason who believed in what the organization taught and who found in its symbolism a genuine vehicle for expressing ideas he cared about. George Washington's Masonry was more practical and less philosophical in character, consistent with Washington's general character, which was more that of a man of action than a man of ideas. He attended lodge meetings regularly in the years before the Revolution, participated in the social and charitable activities of the lodge, and maintained his connection to Masonry throughout his public life. The famous painting of Washington in Masonic regalia at the laying of the Capitol cornerstone is an authentic image. This event actually happened. Washington actually wore the apron, and the ceremony actually included Masonic ritual. Washington's Masonry was, in the context of his time and place, relatively conventional. Virginia Masonry of the late 18th century was part of the fabric of colonial and then Republican gentlemen's culture, a space for the kind of fellowship and mutual support that the social structures of the period valued and that men of Washington's class found natural. Benjamin Franklin's approach to Masonry was, characteristically, more energetic, more intellectually engaged, and more internationally connected than Washington's. Franklin joined a lodge in Philadelphia in 1731 and eventually became Grand Master of the Pennsylvania Grand Lodge. During his years in France, where he served as the American representative to the French government, he was a prominent figure in Parisian Masonic circles. The Lodge of the Nine Sisters in Paris, named for the nine muses of classical mythology, was the most distinguished Masonic lodge in France, with membership that included Voltaire, who was initiated into the lodge in 1778, just weeks before his death. Franklin presided over Voltaire's initiation, and the occasion was one of the most celebrated events in Parisian intellectual life of the period. This moment, the 83-year-old American who had helped create a new republic, initiating the 83-year-old French philosopher who had helped create the intellectual framework of the modern world, has a quality of historical density that is difficult to overstate. Both men were at the end of their lives. Both had seen the world change enormously over the course of their careers. Both found in the Masonic ritual a framework for the values they had spent their lives promoting. It is one of the most genuinely significant moments in Masonic history, and it barely appears in most accounts of either man's life. The persistence of Freemasonry across 3 centuries, across wars and revolutions and the rise and fall of empires, across the enormous changes in technology and society and culture that separate the world of the goose and gridiron tavern from the world of today. This persistence itself requires some explanation. Institutions survive when they continue to meet genuine human needs. The needs that Freemasonry has met and continues to meet are several. Brotherhood, the chosen family, the group of people who will support you without the biological obligation of actual family. This need is not diminished by modernity. If anything, the fragmentation of community life in the contemporary world has made it more acute. The lodge provides a structured context for male friendship that many men find valuable and that ordinary social life makes increasingly difficult to develop in adulthood. Ritual, the experience of participating in something larger than the self, of speaking words that connect you to those who came before and will come after. The secular world offers few rituals with the weight and consistency of the Masonic degree ceremonies. The initiation into each degree is a genuine rite of passage, marking a transition from one status to another in the presence of witnesses who vouch for the authenticity of the transition. This is something that the modern world is not good at providing, meaning the sense that there is significance beneath the surface of ordinary life, that the tools of the stonemason's craft point toward truths about how to live. The Masonic symbolic system is elaborate enough to sustain reflection across a lifetime of membership. A man can be a Mason for 50 years and still find new meaning in the symbols he has been looking at since his initiation. Community, the practical network of people who know each other and will help each other. The lodge is a community of obligation. Members are expected to support each other in genuine ways, not merely to be friendly. This obligation-based community is different from voluntary friendship and different from commercial relationship, and it serves needs that neither of those can fully serve. These needs are real and persistent, and the Masonic Lodge continues to meet them for the men who are willing to go through the admittedly unusual experience of joining it. The streets outside the lodge building are ordinary streets. The building itself is ordinary, perhaps a Victorian structure that has served various purposes over the years before it became a Masonic hall. Perhaps a purpose-built building with a square and compass above the door. Perhaps a rented room in a hotel or a civic building. Inside, the ritual is the same. The words are the same. The aprons are the same. The obligations are the same. 300 years of meetings in rooms like this one. 300 years of men putting on white aprons and sitting in the east and the west and the south and speaking words that connect them to every other man who has spoken those words before. Not sinister, not world dominating, just human. The meeting ends. The lodge is closed. The men go home to their ordinary lives. The specific lodges that shape the history of Freemasonry, the physical places and the communities that gathered in them, are another way into understanding what the organization has actually been over its 300-year history. Lodge number 1, now the Lodge of Antiquity in London, traces its history to before the founding of the Grand Lodge in 1717 and considers itself the oldest Masonic lodge in continuous operation. Its membership records, which go back to the early 18th century, show a cross-section of London's professional and artisan classes, the kind of mixed status membership that was distinctive about the early lodges. The Lodge of the Nine Sisters in Paris, already mentioned in connection with Franklin and Voltaire, was in some ways the most intellectually distinguished lodge in the history of Masonry. Its membership at various points included not only Franklin and Voltaire, but also the astronomer Lalande, the sculptor Houdon, who made the most famous portrait of Washington, the politician Condorcet, and a number of other figures whose names are synonymous with the French Enlightenment. This was not a typical lodge. It was an exceptional gathering of exceptional people, drawn together by the combination of intellectual culture and Masonic fellowship. But it represents the potential of what the lodge could be at its best. The African Lodge, number 459, founded by Prince Hall in Boston, was in some ways the most important lodge in American history. Established in circumstances of systematic exclusion and official non-recognition, it persisted and flourished and gave rise to the entire tradition of Prince Hall Masonry that now counts hundreds of thousands of members. Prince Hall himself was a figure of considerable historical significance, a black man in colonial and post-revolutionary Boston who used the Masonic framework to build community and mutual support among free black men in a society that was structured to deny them both. The Alexandria Washington Lodge, number 22 in Alexandria, Virginia, is named for both the city and its most famous member. Washington was its first worshipful master and attended lodge meetings there throughout his life. The lodge building in Alexandria contains Masonic artifacts connected to Washington, including the apron he wore at the Capitol Cornerstone ceremony, a gift from the Marquis de Lafayette, and the clock that stopped at the moment of his death. These specific places, these rooms where specific people gathered and spoke specific words and made specific commitments to each other, are the real substance of Masonic history. The grand narratives of conspiracy and world domination are abstractions. The lodge meetings are concrete. The question of what the Masonic secrecy actually protects, after 3 centuries of published exposés and online availability of every ritual and every degree, is one that members themselves sometimes struggle to answer. The oaths of secrecy that candidates take at their initiation have always been the most sensational element of the Masonic mystique. The 18th century oaths were vivid in their language, referring to terrible physical penalties for violations of Masonic secrecy. These penalties, having one's throat cut from ear to ear, being buried in the sand of the sea at low water mark, were understood even at the time as symbolic rather than literal, but the dramatic language contributed to the image of Masonry as a potentially violent and dangerous organization. Most Masonic jurisdictions have modified the oath language over the past century, either removing the physical penalty clauses entirely or explicitly clarifying that they are symbolic. What remains protected by the oaths in all jurisdictions are the specific signs, tokens, and words by which Masons recognize each other in lodge or in other contexts. These recognition signs are the genuinely functional secrets of the organization. A Mason who travels to a city where he knows no one can present himself at a local lodge, give the appropriate signs, and be recognized as a brother. The visiting Mason will be welcomed, introduced to the membership, and included in the fellowship of the lodge for the evening. This is the practical function that the secrecy protects, not the revelation of world-dominating plans, but the maintenance of a verification system that makes the Masonic network function. The rituals themselves, the ceremonies of the degrees, the dramatic narrative of Hiram Abiff, the symbolism of the tools, are not really secret in any meaningful sense. They have been published and republished and are freely available. Many Masonic lodges now provide candidates with a ritual book that they can study before their initiation. The experience of the initiation ceremony is not about learning secrets that no one else knows. It is about participating in a shared experience that marks a transition from outside to inside the brotherhood. The transition matters more than the content. This is true of most initiation rituals across cultures and across history. What makes an initiation effective is not the information conveyed, but the experience undergone, the sense of having passed through something significant in the company of witnesses who vouch for the meaning of the passage. The Masonic initiation described by those who have experienced it has this character. Blindfolded, led into an unknown space, asked questions, taking obligations, receiving light. The candidate emerges from the ceremony as a Mason, recognized as such by the brothers present, with a sense of having crossed a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. This experience of threshold crossing, of before and after, of outside and inside, is one of the most persistent human needs, and it is one that modern secular society has become very poor at providing. The Masonic initiation is one of the few secular rituals that takes the idea of initiation seriously and that provides the full experience. The preparation, the ceremony, the witnesses, the after that a genuine initiation requires. Whether what lies on the other side of the threshold justifies the ceremony is a question that each initiate must answer for himself, and the answers vary enormously. But the ceremony itself, the experience of initiation, is something that many men find genuinely valuable, independent of what the lodge subsequently provides. The Masonic calendar, the organization of the Masonic year around specific meetings, specific feast days, specific commemorations, is another dimension of the organization that contributes to its function as a community. The feast of St. John the Baptist on June the 24th, the day on which the Grand Lodge of England was founded in 1717, and the feast of St. John the Evangelist on December the 27th are the two principal Masonic feast days, the occasions for formal dinners that bring the lodge together as a social as well as a ceremonial community. These dinners, the festive board, in Masonic terminology, are occasions for the specific kind of male fellowship that the lodge provides at its best. The ceremony of the dinner itself, the toasts, the songs, the structured informality that follows the formal ceremony of the lodge meeting, creates a context for connection that is different from ordinary socializing and that many men find genuinely enjoyable. The songs are particularly distinctive. Masonic songbooks, collections of songs written for lodge occasions, have been published since the early 18th century, and the tradition of singing at lodge dinners has been maintained in many lodges continuously since the organization's earliest days. There is something affecting about the image of men in their white aprons at a long table after the formal meeting, singing songs that men in their white aprons have sung at long tables for 300 years. The content of the songs ranges from the genuinely beautiful to the frankly terrible, in the way of lodge songs in every era. What matters is not the quality of the music, but the act of singing together, the experience of making something with others that no individual can make alone. The night is quiet. The meeting is ending. The lodge is being closed with the same ceremony with which it was opened. The master speaks the final words. The wardens respond. The lights are dimmed in a specific order. The lodge passes from the active state to the dormant state. The men put away their aprons. They shake hands in the particular way they have shaken hands for 300 years. They walk out into the ordinary night. Tomorrow, the lodge building will be locked and dark. The aprons will be folded. The ritual implements will be stored in the cases. The lodge room will be just a room. Chairs and tables and walls and floor. Nothing remarkable about it. But something happened there. Something that is small and human and genuine. Not world historical, not conspiratorial, not transcendent. Just men choosing to meet, choosing to maintain a tradition, choosing to be responsible for each other in the specific way that the Masonic obligation requires. 300 years of this. Tuesday evenings and festive boards and initiation ceremonies, and handshakes and aprons and songs. The symbols of the stonemason's craft pointing toward truths about how to live. The rough ashlar being worked, slowly and imperfectly, toward the perfect ashlar. The lodge is closed. The night is quiet. One more thing deserves to be said about Freemasonry before this story ends. Something about the relationship between the organization and the idea of secrecy itself. Secrecy is not by nature sinister. It is a normal and necessary feature of human social life. Every family has things it does not share with strangers. Every friendship has dimensions that are private. Every professional relationship involves confidential information. The concept of privacy, of things that belong to some people and not to others, is fundamental to human community. What makes secrecy suspicious is the combination of power and exclusion. When a powerful institution operates in secret, excluding public scrutiny from decisions that affect people who have no say in them, there's legitimate reason for concern. The secrecy of government deliberations, of corporate decision making, of judicial proceedings that affect people's lives. These are genuinely important issues of democratic accountability. Masonic secrecy is of a different character. It protects private ritual and private community from public scrutiny. The decisions made in a lodge meeting do not affect people outside the lodge. They affect only the members themselves, who have chosen to be there and who have accepted the terms of the organization. This is the same secrecy that protects any private association, a book club, a dinner party, a religious congregation. The suspicion of Masonic secrecy conflates these two very different things: the legitimate secrecy of private association and the illegitimate secrecy of power operating without accountability. Because Masonic membership has historically included powerful people, and because powerful people who are Masons sometimes cooperate in ways that serve the common interests, the secrecy of the lodge has been blamed for the effects of power generally. But this is a confusion. The power of the judge, who is also a Mason, does not come from his Masonry. It comes from his position as a judge. His Masonry may influence his social network and his informal relationships, but the secrecy of the lodge is not what protects his power from accountability. The institutional structures of the legal system are what do that, and those structures are the appropriate subject of public scrutiny and reform. The Masonic Lodge is a private association. Its secrets are the secrets of a private association. Treating it as a sinister conspiracy requires a misunderstanding of the distinction between private association and institutional power. A distinction that is important to maintain clearly if democratic accountability is to mean anything. This does not mean that Freemasonry is above criticism. The tendency of Masonic networks to favor their members in professional and institutional contexts, the old boys network problem, is a genuine concern where it operates in institutions that are supposed to be neutral. The historical exclusion of women and black men from full Masonic participation is a genuine failure to live up to stated values. The sometimes excessive secrecy that has protected genuinely problematic behavior, the Morgan affairs being the most extreme American example, has at times made the organization complicit in things it should not have been. These are legitimate criticisms of specific practices and failures, and they should be made clearly and honestly. They are different from the conspiracy theory, which attributes to Freemasonry a power and a coherence that the actual organization simply does not have. The honest account of Freemasonry is this: it is a fraternal organization founded in the early 18th century that has attracted some extraordinarily significant members and has played a modest but real role in the intellectual and social life of the past 3 centuries. It has failed in various ways and at various times to live up to its stated values. It has been used by members who should have known better for purposes that its principles condemn. It has been persecuted by governments and churches and political movements for being something that it was not. It is also, in its ordinary daily operation, a community of men who find value in ritual and in fellowship and in charitable work, who meet on Tuesday evenings and speak old words and help each other and go home to their ordinary lives. This is not the stuff of great drama. It does not explain why the world is the way it is. It does not reveal the hidden architecture of power. It is just people meeting in a room with aprons on. The building is dark now. The meeting is long over. The city goes about its business outside, indifferent to what happened inside. But something happened inside. Something small and human and genuine. Something that will happen again next Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and the Tuesday after that. As it has happened, Tuesday after Tuesday for 300 years. The rough ashlar being worked slowly and imperfectly toward the perfect ashlar. The work that is never finished, the brotherhood that endures, the wider world of secret societies, of which Freemasonry is the most famous and most studied example, provides useful context for understanding what the Masonic Lodge is and is not. Human beings have always formed secret groups. The mystery religions of the ancient world, the Eleusinian mysteries, the rites of Mithras, the Orphic cults, were organized around initiation, secret knowledge, and the experience of spiritual transformation. The trade guilds of the medieval period, the ancestors of the stonemasons guilds, from which Freemasonry claims descent, had their own oaths and passwords and internal hierarchies. The learned societies of the Renaissance, the Rosicrucians, the various Hermetic brotherhoods, combined esoteric knowledge with fraternal structure in ways that directly anticipated the Masonic model. What these organizations share, across enormous differences of time and place and content, is the recognition that certain kinds of experience and certain kinds of community require a protected space to flourish. The mystery cult needed secrecy to maintain the power of the initiatory experience. If everyone knew what happened in the rites would lose their capacity to transform. The trade guild needed secrecy to protect proprietary knowledge from competitors. The learned society needed secrecy to allow the free exchange of ideas that official channels would not permit. Freemasonry inherited all three of these functions: the initiatory, the guild, and the intellectual, and combined them in a single organization that then adapted itself to the specific needs of the 18th century and beyond. The initiatory function, the experience of passage from outside to inside, from profane to sacred, from ignorance to knowledge, has always been the most emotionally significant aspect of Masonic practice. The initiation ceremonies of the 3 degrees are the heart of the Masonic experience, and the men who found lasting value in the Masonic membership are typically those for whom the initiation was a genuine experience rather than merely an inconvenient prerequisite for joining a social club. The guild function, the network of mutual support and professional connection, has been the most practically significant aspect of Masonic membership throughout the organization's history. The brother who will hire you, recommend you, help you when you are in difficulty. This is what the Masonic network has provided and what it continues to provide in ways that are sometimes criticized and sometimes valued, but that are undeniably real. The intellectual function, the discussion of ideas in a protected space, the exploration of philosophical and moral questions in a context of shared commitment to seeking truth, was most significant in the 18th century, when the Masonic Lodge was one of the few spaces where certain kinds of discussion were possible. It has diminished in importance as those discussions have moved into more open contexts, but it has not disappeared entirely. The symbolic system of Freemasonry continues to provide a framework for moral reflection that some men find genuinely useful. The Masonic legacy is therefore multiple and somewhat contradictory. It is the legacy of a brotherhood that included Washington and Voltaire and Mozart, and that contributed in its specific way to the intellectual and political movements that shaped the modern world. It is also the legacy of an organization that excluded women entirely and admitted black men only to a separate, lesser recognized structure. It is the legacy of a genuinely significant philosophical tradition that has often been reduced by its own members and by outsiders to something either sinister or merely quaint. The true legacy, if there is such a thing, is probably the demonstration that human beings, left to themselves, will naturally create structures of brotherhood, ritual, and mutual obligation. That the impulse to belong to something larger than oneself, to mark transitions with ceremony, to make solemn commitments in the presence of witnesses, this impulse is as persistent as any other human need, and it will find expression whether or not formal organizations exist to channel it. Freemasonry has been, for 300 years, one of the most elaborate and most sustained expressions of this impulse in the modern world. It has done this imperfectly, as human institutions always do, but it has done it consistently across enormous changes in the cultural landscape, because the need it serves is real and persistent. The building with the frosted windows, the Tuesday evenings, the white aprons and the old words, and the handshakes and the songs, the friends who will help you, and the obligation to help them in return. This is not glamorous. This is not sinister. This is just the particular shape that the human need for brotherhood took in the 18th century and has maintained through change and adaptation and imperfection into the present. The street outside is quiet. The meeting ended hours ago. The lodge building is dark. Somewhere in the city, other people are sleeping. Other buildings are dark. Other meetings have ended, and other conversations have been put away for the night. And in the archive of the lodge, the records of meetings going back decades or centuries, the names of men who sat in those chairs and spoke those words, and shook those hands, and then went back to their ordinary lives, the continuity persists. The record of the meeting of the 24th of June, 1717 is there. The names of the men who were in the Goose and Gridiron Tavern when Freemasonry as we know it began. Names that meant something to someone once, and that are now only history. But the institution they started is still here, changed, smaller, more transparent, less mysterious than it once was. But here, Tuesday evenings, the rough ashlar, the work continues. Sleep now. The end.